So if you viewed the last video lecture, you know that progressivism, the progressive era reform movement generally speaking, was more or less a middle-class revolt, or some people like to think of it as a search for order. You should also understand that on a basic level, this really does emerge on a local level. I mean, like in places like Chicago with Jane Addams, or New York with the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. But I want you to stop and think for just a second. What would happen if, in the case of the New York Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, the city of New York simply passed a law that said, look, if you're going to have this many people working in the same area, you're going to need to have adequate fire escapes, you're going to have fire extinguishers, that kind of thing. And let's also assume for a minute that doing that, having that law, is going to make it more expensive to do business in the city. If you're in the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, what might you do? Or the company, that is. Well, I can tell you what I might do. I might think about moving somewhere else in the state of New York. So that's going to be cheaper, theoretically anyway, to do business in, for example, Albany, where they don't have that law, versus New York City, where they've just passed it. So let's say, for sake of argument, that all of New York passes a law. New York State passes a law that makes it more expensive to have these safety precautions. At that point, what I might think about doing is moving to a place like New Jersey. Okay? Do you see the trend that is unfolding here? If you're going to make these laws that are designed to protect those that have a hard time of protecting themselves, if you're going to make them meaningful, you're going to need to have this at the federal level. In other words, you're going to have to expand the role, the power, the authority of the federal government. Okay? And that's exactly what you're going to see here with the progressive movement as the 20th century begins to unfold. You're going to see people at the highest levels of government that begin to implement laws that are designed to protect people that are most vulnerable from things like industrial capitalism. And in general, this is going to be the law of the land. I'll explain a little bit more as we get further, but one of the reasons that you're seeing mainstream politicians take up this cause is because some of the radicals that are really pushing these issues to the forefront of American political life. We've talked about socialists. These are people that want to radically expand the government, expand it to the extent that the government is now in control of things like the banks, the railroads, things of that sort. You have groups like the anarchists that just want to destroy government as we know it, what they're going to re-implement after the government has been taken down. We're not exactly sure. You've got organizations like the Industrial Workers of the World, the Wobblies, that want to form one massive global industrial union and then pick a precise time to strike, to walk off of work, and basically cripple commerce throughout the world, which, of course, would crumble governments throughout the world. Now, you think about these things. These are very radical alternatives when it comes to what is to be done. But around about the same time, for instance, in 1908, Eugene V. Debs, we've talked about Debs before, he runs on the Socialist Party ticket for president. And so you'd think as somebody as radical as somebody like Debs, who wants to take over the banks, would not get maybe a dozen votes or so. Debs takes home 400,000 votes in 1908. Now, let me be clear about something. He lost, and lost decisively, in 1908. But 400,000 people is not a drop in the bucket. And what that demonstrates is if you are a Democrat or a Republican, at the very least you better be paying lip service to some of these things that people consider to be very important in their day-to-day life. Whether that is expanding the role of government to protect those that could not protect themselves, or just having something as simple as government play the role of referee in the marketplace. Okay? So let's move on. If there's one progressive era president, or I was going to say politician, that you should be mindful of, that would be none other than Theodore Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt. Okay? Now, Roosevelt was a Republican, but he was also very much a product of the progressive era. He was born into an affluent family, and as such, I think I described this with Jane Addams, really felt it was his duty in life, middle-class people feel this way generally, to care for and look out for those that were less fortunate for them, or than them. Now, in the late 19th century, Teddy Roosevelt has a meteoric rise in terms of his political career. In 1896, he was the fire commissioner for the city of New York. And that was a very hot summer for New Yorkers. Now, it doesn't get nearly as hot in New York as it does in a place like Texas, but nonetheless, when you've got all that concrete in one place, and you've got a relatively humid environment, it's going to make for some fairly concerning public health issues, the spread of disease being the tip of the iceberg. So, in addition to a really hot summer, you also had slum landlords that would pack people in, as we know from the writings of Jacob Riis, pack people into a one-bedroom apartment, 10, 11, 12, sometimes more than that. And so you've got a lot of people living on top of each other in conditions that can at best be described as unhealthy. And there are no rules. There's nothing that says that an apartment has to have a window or has to have lighting or has to have a proper ventilation system. And so, citing the public health concerns, one of the things that Roosevelt does in 1896 is he makes it a city law that if you are a landlord, you have to provide basic, essential safety necessities if you're going to rent to the New York public. Now, as you might imagine, this doesn't win him too many friends in New York City, but upstate New York, in places like Buffalo and Albany, he's becoming a very popular politician. And throughout the rest of the country, he's becoming a rock star. As a matter of fact, he's one of the most popular figures within the Republican Party. 1900 was the re-election year of our good friend William McKinley. And if you remember right, McKinley in 1896 was the guy that had campaigned on the idea of elect me and I'll stay out of your business. If you're John Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, I won't interfere or will not regulate it. So at the same time that you've got the taking off of Teddy Roosevelt's political career, you also got a re-election for a different kind of Republican, what we've called a laissez-faire Republican. And so McKinley's got a problem. What do you do with this guy that's very, very popular but completely opposite of your political view, your economic view of the world? And so the thing that McKinley ultimately decides he's going to do is he's going to put Teddy Roosevelt in maybe the least powerful position in American politics, or at least it was before the 21st century. He's going to make him his vice presidential candidate, okay? And so when the election takes place, the Republican Party has the best of both worlds. You've got your conservative Republican, your William McKinley, and he's, of course, going to take home all the votes that he did in 1896. And you've got your progressive Republican, Teddy Roosevelt, who's an up-and-comer in the Republican Party. So it's a landslide victory in 1900, and Teddy Roosevelt seems to be kind of put in his place to where he can do no harm as the laissez-faire Republicans see it. The only problem with vice president is that it's one heartbeat away from the presidency. Nobody in a million years thought that William McKinley was not going to ride out his second term, but unfortunately McKinley was assassinated by an individual named Leon Solzhenitsyn, okay? Now, what that means is Teddy Roosevelt is now the President of the United States. And so what began as a plot to kind of depower or keep the power away from what many considered to be a dangerous politician like Teddy Roosevelt, now all of a sudden he is the man in the Oval Office. Okay. Now, Teddy Roosevelt is going to develop a reputation as a trust buster, breaking up the monopolies. But there's one thing that I need you to understand before I go any further to that end. Roosevelt was not anti-capitalism. He was not anti-big business. He believed that large corporations were very necessary to the American economy, and he didn't want to destroy them. But he did want to get them to acknowledge the power of the federal government, and furthermore, he also wanted them to play by rules that made the marketplace work. I mean, made it work not just for the American tobaccos and the U.S. steels of the world, but made it work for everybody, including consumers. So one of the things that I need you to understand about Teddy Roosevelt is he wanted to regulate the American economy, grow the size of the American government to be able to play the role of referee. And on the most basic level, one of the things that the referee needed to keep in mind is you should have fair economic, financial opportunities or possibilities in the marketplace. And of course, if you've got a monopoly, if you've got a trust, that was not going to be the case. And so Roosevelt chose the Northern Securities Company as an example to be made when it comes to his thoughts on trust busting. Northern Securities was headed up by an investment banker by the name of J.P. Morgan, who was one of the most hated men in America at the time anyway. But when Teddy Roosevelt ordered him to break apart the Northern Securities Company, charging that it was a monopoly, basically what Morgan said was, make me. Go ahead and make me. I'm a wealthy investment banker and I run this country. You work for me, not the other way around. And so what Roosevelt does is he sues Morgan and the Northern Securities Company in federal court, and lo and behold, he wins. Okay? The federal court system defined Northern Securities as a monopoly and ordered that it be broken apart. This was one of the largest, most powerful, richest corporations in the world, and all of a sudden, people that were, dismissing the seriousness of Teddy Roosevelt, people like U.S. Steel, or I guess corporations like U.S. Steel, American Tobacco, DuPont Chemical, they all began to get in line when it comes to what can we do to comply with your antitrust laws? How do we clean up our act, so to speak, when it comes to complying to a fair marketplace? Okay? So the Northern Securities suit really made Teddy Roosevelt when it comes to this idea of a trust buster. Now, in 1904, Roosevelt's up for election. And notice that I didn't say re-election because he inherited the presidency. Now, Roosevelt campaigns on the idea of a square deal, right? Now, if you think about a square, it's got 4 equal sides, right? Well, what this square deal implied was if you elect him, he would continue to regulate the American economy so that it not only protected those people that could not protect themselves. So I'm talking about people like women, consumers, workers, city dwellers. He would also create a type of government that was much more proactive in looking after the well-being of the American people. Okay, but nonetheless, what the square deal amounts to is an expansion of the federal government. You're going to see the government grow and become more powerful under Teddy Roosevelt. How so? Well, there are a laundry list of laws that I can point to, but I'm going to cite a few here with you while I've got you. First of all, in 1906, you get the Meat Quality and Inspection Act. By now, you should have read The Jungle, or at least come close to reading it. And you know that what's going into meat is not always meat. And so therefore, one of the things that this Meat Quality Inspection Act does is it tells the meatpacking industry, look, clean up your act or we will shut you down. Same thing with the Pure Food and Drug Act in 1906. The reason that many of you and we feel comfortable taking a sip of a bottle of water or breathing the air is because we do have an FDA that says that this product has been tested, it has been evaluated, and it's safe. Okay. The Keating-Owens Act, what this does is it seriously limits the use of child labor. The 17th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution in 1913 allows for direct primaries, the direct election of senators. You also see environmental reform. In 1905, Teddy Roosevelt gives us the National Park Service, and in 1906 he gives us the Forest Service Act. And what this does collectively is it puts millions, maybe not millions, but definitely thousands of federally owned acres of land on reserve. So even though logging companies, oil companies very well may want to rip into the earth and exploit its resources, what you've got is the federal government expanding its role and protecting an individual, in this case the environment, that could not protect itself. Okay. All right then, so in 1908 it was another election year, and Roosevelt says, look, I've basically served 2 back-to-back terms, I've done enough good, I've got the ball rolling, now it's up to you to take over from here. And so before he leaves on an African safari, he goes ahead and he hand selects the guy that's going to take his place, a friend of his by the name of William Howard Taft. Okay. Now, Taft was a progressive, but he wasn't exactly, dealing with the same circumstances that Teddy Roosevelt was dealing with, especially when it comes to Congress. Long and short is the presidency of Teddy Roosevelt had given the Republican conservatives in Congress time to really circle their wagons. And one of the things that they get Taft to do is not only back off of progressive-era legislation, they also, through many circumstances that are difficult to really talk about in a short amount of time, he lets a dirty little secret out of the bag. Taft Taft revealed that Roosevelt never really did get tough with a company like U.S. Steel. He more or less had a gentleman's agreement with them. Look, we both know that you have problems. We're going to go ahead and work together while you clean up those problems. And, I'm going to give you time and even resources to the federal government. He didn't crack down as tough and as harshly as maybe he was given credit for. Well, this infuriates Teddy Roosevelt, and he storms all the way back from Africa, and he demands that the Republican Party remove Taft in the upcoming re-election of 1912, and instead put him back on the ballot because he was eligible for one more term, well, at least one more term. Anyway, Roosevelt was told no. Told thanks, but no thanks. The Republicans were very happy with Taft, and, his services would not be needed. Not content with this answer, what Teddy Roosevelt does is form something called the Progressive Party, or the Bull Moose Party, and what this party is dedicated to is social justice, okay? How do I mean? Well, the campaign strategy or philosophy, slogan, whatever you want to call it, in 2012, or excuse me, I keep saying that, for 1912, was New Nationalism. And what New Nationalism meant to Teddy Roosevelt was that the federal government would continue to expand because it had to protect human welfare, that the federal government would be the key protector of human welfare, and it would continue to pursue the likes of social justice. So yes, we're getting more government, but again, the government's expanding to protect those individuals who are most vulnerable to things like industrial capitalism. So I want you to do the math. You've essentially got two Republicans running against one Democrat, and that really opens the door for the other party, this being the Democratic Party. Now, if you've been following along with us, you haven't seen too many Democrats in the White House ever since Abraham Lincoln was elected in 1860. This is really going to provide a useful opportunity for the Democrat Woodrow Wilson. Now, even though Wilson was a Democrat, he can also be considered a progressive. Or certainly his presidency could be considered progressive. But whereas Teddy Roosevelt believed in New Nationalism, Wilson really disagreed with that mentality, that one of the last things that America needed was more government. That he agreed with the idea that the marketplace needed to be made fairer, but that did not mean that the government was going to supposedly assume the role of the protector of the American people and micromanage, okay? So anyway, the way that I like to think about New Freedom is Woodrow Wilson calling for less government. But when he actually gets into the White House, one of the things that you see is more government. One of the things that I want you to be mindful of when it comes to the Wilson presidency is the establishment of the Federal Reserve. Now, Wilson and one of his main advisors, a guy by the name of Louis Brandeis, really begin to take on the power of Wall Street, these wealthy investment bankers who both men felt had way too much power, and were yielding that in a way that was very rarely, beneficial to the American public. And so what the Federal Reserve did is it essentially regulated Wall Street. It told Wall Street various things that it could do and certainly things that it could not do, okay? And so what Wilson does is basically pursue similar things when it comes to playing the role of protector, even though he didn't really talk about that on the campaign trail in 1912, okay? And so what you're going to see here is a growing governmental bureaucracy, but it's going to be something that is going to really not only have a legacy on American politics, American society generally speaking, it's going to be something that really ebbs and flows. And I don't want you to leave this lecture thinking that, the Progressive era solved all the problems that were, prevalent in American life. You still had really violent strikes like the Ludlow Massacre in Ludlow, Colorado, where company, quote-unquote, police essentially burned down a miners' encampment, and women and children were also killed in this massacre. You also have the issue of a growing federal government. I mean, we can clearly see that there are reasons that the government needed to get bigger and needed to have more power, but at the same time, this growing federal bureaucracy would become controversial in time, certainly toward the end of the 20th century. The idea of big government is almost akin to a dirty word, okay? So you are going to have these big agencies, and some of them are beginning to do some good, but they're also quite expensive to run, and they don't always allow for the quickest amount of growth when it comes to business. So let me leave you with this. What the progressive era did when it comes to national politics is pushed a lot of this debate revolving around social, economic issues to the forefront of American politics. The radicals did not allow these issues to die, and therefore, if you wanted to be elected anything like even dog catcher, you had to at least pay lip service to them. It forced Republicans and Democrats to take up these issues in mainstream American life, and it would set the stage for American politics well through 1917. You could even make the case for a little bit longer than that, but certainly through World War I. Okay? Now, in our upcoming lecture, one of the things that you're going to find is that World War I really does allow people like Woodrow Wilson to take progressive era reform, in his case financial reform, to another level, because World War II is essentially a national emergency. The federal government was the only agency in American life with the resources, wherewithal, or legal capacity to regulate and organize the country in order for victory. At the same time, there were progressives, people like Jane Addams, wanted the president to use that excuse, that cover of the war emergency, to really expand this growing governmental state where the government's trying to play the role of referee. And so when we get to World War I, we'll talk about the continuation of progressive era reform.